I don't expect you were anticipating a lady stumbling into your arms twice in one evening, but I do appreciate your quick reflexes, sir. As Mr. Reginald Blackburn set the seemingly mishap-prone Miss Poppy Garrison away from him, then helped her find her balance when she immediately began to wobble, he struggled for some manner of polite response, although what type of response he could possibly give was quite beyond him at the moment. He thought he'd been prepared to deal with American ladies, whom Bertie, the Prince of Wales, had told him were overly exuberant at times, but nothing could have prepared him for the unusual experience of dealing with a young lady like Miss Garrison. To his relief, Miss Garrison did not seem to expect a response from him, because she suddenly seemed to realize her bustle was askew. Reaching behind her, she began trying to tug the bustle back into place, evidently unconcerned that trying to set herself to rights in the middle of a society event was not something guests were accustomed to seeing. Poor Mrs. Kruger, the sponsor of the family circle dancing class, seemed to have been rendered speechless as she gaped at Miss Garrison, a concerning circumstance since Reginald had been hoping that lady would step forward and break the uncomfortable silence that had settled around them. Glancing to his cousin, Charles Wynne, the 9th Earl of Lonsdale, who could normally be counted on to save a situation when it turned uncomfortable, Reginald noticed that Charles was currently gazing at Miss Garrison with a dazed expression in his eyes. That expression suggested it was highly unlikely his cousin would be the one to break the awkward silence. It wasn't that Reginald couldn't say he blamed Charles for sporting a dazed expression, because Miss Garrison, even with her propensity for unusual mishaps, was a lady who drew a man's notice. She was above average height, but instead of being overly thin and willowy, she possessed a most impressive figure, something he could personally attest to, since that figure had been pressed up against him twice in the past hour. Her delightful curves were displayed to perfection in the brightly colored gypsy costume she was wearing, the unusual colors of her costume complementing skin that was not the pale white he was accustomed to seeing. Instead, her skin appeared to be sun-kissed, leading one the impression that Miss Garrison was a lady who spent more than the average time outdoors. Her hair was a rich shade of gold, mixed with lighter strands that suggested she often went without a hat, but it was her face that held a person's attention. She wasn't what one would consider a classic beauty, since she did not possess the delicate features that were currently in fashion, but there was something almost mesmerizing about the way the features she did possess were arranged on her face. Her eyes, a peculiar shade of cobalt blue, were unusually large and rimmed with dark lashes that were at distinct odds with her golden hair. Her brows were finely sculpted, as were her cheekbones, and her nose was slim and had just a hint of a tilt to it. Her lips were a perfectly normal shade of pink, but there was something about the fullness of her lips that lent her an air of mystery, while the creases at the very corner of those lips gave one the impression she smiled often and enjoyed life to the fullest. "It looks to me, Miss Garrison, as if you could use some assistance, which I am only too happy to provide. May I suggest we repair to the retiring room in order to afford you the privacy I'm sure you've simply neglected to realize you need?" Pulling his attention from Miss Garrison, who was now emitting what sounded like grunts as she struggled to beat her bustle back into place, Reginald settled his gaze on the young lady who'd just stepped up to join them, Miss Adele Tooker. Miss Tooker had been one of the first ladies presented to his cousin, an introduction Charles had certainly enjoyed, because Miss Tooker, from what Mr. McAllister had whispered to Reginald as Charles had been kissing the lady's hand, was most sought after this season. She was a lovely lady, possessed a classically beautiful face, and more importantly, possessed a sizable fortune. She was also, according to Mr. McAllister, enthralled with the aristocracy, and given the way she'd fluttered her lashes at Charles, it had been clear that Miss Tooker would not be opposed to becoming better acquainted with an honest-to-goodness earl. Ladies such as Miss Tooker, those overly anxious to acquire titles in exchange for the large dowries their fathers settled on them, were exactly why Reginald's father had insisted Reginald accompany his cousin to America.